The air in Beijing pulsed with color and rhythm. Silk banners rippled against the evening sky, dancers in dazzling red and gold swept across the Grand Plaza, and the deep roll of ceremonial drums echoed like thunder. Cameras from every corner of the globe zoomed in on the figure stepping forward, a leader whose very presence seemed to bend the spotlight toward him. Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of India, walked onto a red carpet so vivid it looked as if history itself had been unrolled at his feet. The choreography was no accident. Fireworks crackled overhead, melodies evoked the spirit of both dragon and elephant, and Chinese dignitaries lined the path, applauding with unusual warmth. It was a spectacle reserved for emperors, for world-defining moments. And that's exactly what it was meant to be. Because this wasn't just about honoring a guest. This was China sending a message to the world. India was no longer a nation to be courted with polite gestures. It was to be celebrated, elevated, positioned as a partner in shaping the century to come. But if the scene thrilled some, it chilled others. In Washington, officials who had long assumed India would remain tethered to the US camp watched in growing unease. For years, America had spoken of India as a strategic ally, a counterweight to China. Yet here was Beijing, rolling out a red carpet that stretched not only across a plaza but across the narrative of the future. The images beamed across television screens told a story far different from the one the West had scripted. China rolled out the red carpet for Modi, and the United States was left in panic. The timing was merciless. As Trump's tariffs battered Indian exports and trust frayed between New Delhi and Washington, Beijing seized the stage with a theater of friendship. Social media lit up with disbelief. Did China just outmaneuver America? Asked one commentator. Is this the beginning of the Asian century? For America, the answer was more painful than the question itself. The choreography in Beijing wasn't only about Modi's steps, it was about the West's stumble. And as the music swelled and the cameras captured every triumphant smile, one thing became clear: this was no ordinary welcome. It was a warning shot, and it left the world wondering, what happens when Asia's giants begin to dance together? Just days before Beijing unfurled its red carpet, Modi had stood in Tokyo, shaking hands with Japan's leadership, speaking of technology, resilience, and shared destiny. That visit alone was enough to capture headlines. But the true shockwave came when his plane touched down in China. To travel from Japan to Beijing in one arc was no coincidence. It was choreography, a deliberate statement that Asia's future could be written in Asian ink, not in the fading scripts of Washington or Brussels. The timing was brutal for the United States. Trump's tariffs had already torn at the fragile fabric of US-India economic ties. Industries in New Delhi felt the sting as Washington weaponized trade, leaving many Indians to ask the question aloud: if America treats its strategic partners this way, what would it do to its rivals? The trust was fractured, the resentment real. And into that fracture stepped Beijing, smiling, applauding, and rolling out a stage fit for a civilization, not just a country. This wasn't merely a photo op. This was a recalibration of history. For decades, America's foreign policy had been built on the assumption that India, the world's largest democracy, would remain aligned with the West, a loyal counterbalance against China's rise. But in those dazzling Beijing ceremonies, the assumption looked naive, almost arrogant. India wasn't auditioning for a supporting role in America's drama. It was walking onto its own stage, with its own script. And that's where the stakes rise beyond diplomacy. Because if India and China, together representing nearly 3 billion people and some of the fastest-growing economies on Earth, were to find common ground, the very geometry of global power would tilt. Suddenly, the Atlantic would no longer be the center of the world. Suddenly, Washington would no longer be the undisputed narrator of the global story. This is about who gets to write tomorrow's world order, one analyst observed, and it may no longer be the West. Those words carried both exhilaration and dread. For millions across Asia and the global South, the idea was liberating. Finally, a multipolar world where dignity wasn't dictated from Western capitals. But for Washington, it was a nightmare, an unraveling of the very order it had spent a century constructing. The American establishment could dismiss it as theater, but they knew the truth: symbols matter. They shape perception, and perception drives power. The sight of Modi celebrated in Beijing wasn't just optics. It was the living image of a possible future where America no longer had the final word. And yet, this was only the beginning of the story. Because to truly feel the tremors of this moment, we must step into the shoes of the antagonist in this unfolding drama. Not just the United States as a superpower, but the very mindset of Western arrogance that had taken India for granted for too long. For more than half a century, the United States carried itself as the unquestioned architect of the global order. Its leaders spoke of freedom, democracy, and equality, but behind those lofty words lay a very different reality. A reality of control, double standards, and the expectation that others, especially nations of the global south, should play junior roles in America's drama. India, with its billion people and proud democratic tradition, was no exception. Washington praised New Delhi in speeches, but in practice, it often treated India as little more than a convenient counterweight to China, a pawn on the chessboard of containment. Consider the pattern. Whenever America needed India, whether for Cold War leverage, for markets to absorb its goods, or for military alignment, it draped itself in the language of partnership. But when India charted an independent path, Washington's tone shifted. Suddenly, India became unreliable, difficult, nationalistic. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. America celebrated democracy when it served U.S. interests, and punished it when it produced policies that didn't. The trade wars under Donald Trump were a brutal example of this arrogance. With a stroke of a pen, tariffs hammered Indian exports, threatening millions of livelihoods. And yet Washington expected India to smile politely and continue pledging loyalty, as if a nation built on thousands of years of civilization would accept being treated as a subordinate. America lectured India on free trade while using tariffs as weapons. It preached about open markets while protecting its own with iron walls. To many in New Delhi, it felt less like partnership and more like a colonial hangover, an empire speaking down to a proud people. And it wasn't just economics. Sanctions became another tool of dominance. When India explored energy partnerships outside Washington's approval, America threatened penalties. When India bought defense systems from Russia, officials wagged fingers and demanded compliance. All the while, America spoke the language of sovereignty and choice on the global stage. But the message to India was clear. Sovereignty was acceptable only if it aligned with U.S. strategy. This arrogance was not new. It was inherited. The West, steeped in centuries of colonial rule, had always assumed it had the right to dictate terms to the rest of the world. London once carried that imperial baton. Then Washington picked it up. Both wore the same mask, civilization, freedom, democracy, but both wielded the same whip, control, dominance, and exclusion. The irony was rich. The same powers that once carved up Asia and Africa now scolded rising nations about rules-based order. Rules, of course, that they had written for themselves. For India, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. How could Washington claim to be a champion of equality while treating a civilization of 1.4 billion people as a sidekick? How could it preach democracy while punishing one of the largest democracies for making its own choices? Slowly, resentment grew. And when Modi stepped onto that red carpet in Beijing, the resentment crystallized into something more powerful: possibility. The West had taken India for granted, assuming it would always orbit the American sun. But the images from Beijing told another story. A different constellation was forming, one where India and China, two ancient civilizations, might shine together. For Washington, the arrogance of assuming eternal loyalty had given way to the panic of realizing loyalty was never guaranteed. And that's the heart of the villain's downfall. Arrogance blinds. It convinces empires that their dominance is eternal. It blinds them to the dignity of others, to the aspirations of civilizations long dismissed. America and its Western allies had grown accustomed to dictating terms. But what happens when the so-called global leader suddenly finds itself sidelined? To understand the spectacle of Beijing's red carpet, one must first understand the journey of the guest walking upon it. India is not a nation that appeared in the 20th century, nor a state stitched together by colonial hands. It is a civilization ancient and unbroken, with roots stretching back 5,000 years. A land that gave the world the zero, Ayurveda, yoga, Sanskrit philosophy. Empires rose and fell across the globe, but India's cultural heartbeat endured, shaping knowledge, art, and spirituality for millennia. Yet, for much of modern history, India's voice was muffled. Colonial subjugation reduced this vast civilization into a subject of empire, its resources drained, its people shackled. When independence came in 1947, the world underestimated India. The West, still drunk on its own power, saw a poor, chaotic state, not a resilient civilization reclaiming its agency. But India proved otherwise. Against the odds, it chose democracy, not dictatorship, not one-party control, but the messy, vibrant, inclusive system where every vote mattered. While others faltered, India's democratic experiment endured, making it the largest democracy on earth. The decades that followed told a story of resilience. Through poverty and political turbulence, India built an identity of strength. Its engineers and scientists became global pioneers. Its IT hubs in Bangalore and Hyderabad turned into the backbone of Silicon Valley innovation. Indian biotech firms developed vaccines that reached the poorest corners of the planet. Its diaspora spread across continents, becoming CEOs, scholars, and leaders, carrying with them both tradition and modernity. Slowly, India's presence was felt not as a junior partner to the West, but as an independent force, one with its own compass. Narendra Modi's rise to power represented a sharp inflection point in this arc of civilizational resurgence. Unlike leaders who once bent instinctively toward Washington or Moscow, Modi styled himself as a leader of multipolar pragmatism. His foreign policy moves were bold and symbolic. With Japan, he built technology and infrastructure ties, signaling India's ambition to be more than a cheap labor market. With Russia, he secured energy and defense deals, reminding the West that India would not be dictated to. And now, with China, the most dramatic move of all, accepting the red carpet, not as flattery, but as recognition of India's equal stature in Asia. This pivot was more than transactional diplomacy. It was a statement of civilizational pride. India was not aligning with China against America. It was aligning with itself, its history, its autonomy, its right to engage with every power on its own terms. For too long, Washington had assumed that India's rise would occur within the architecture of Western leadership. Modi shattered that assumption. He presented India not as a follower of the West, but as the voice of the global South, the collective of nations too long ignored, too long lectured, too long excluded from writing the rules. For millions across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, India's story resonated. Here was a democracy, born from colonial chains, now walking confidently into partnerships of choice rather than obligation. Here was a leader willing to say no to Western pressure and yes to South-South solidarity. It was not just about trade deals or handshakes. It was about dignity. When Modi stepped onto Beijing's red carpet, the symbolism reached beyond India and China. It whispered to every nation once dismissed as developing or third world, history is turning, and your time is coming. India's rise was not measured only in GDP numbers or stock markets. It was measured in the assertion that civilizations long denied a seat at the table would now demand one. It was measured in satellites launched from Sriharikota, in Indian doctors serving in African villages, in cultural diplomacy that blended Bollywood with philosophy. This was not a country begging for validation. This was a civilization reclaiming its rightful place in shaping tomorrow. And that is what made Beijing's ceremony electrifying. Fireworks and dances were not just decoration, they were symbols of recognition. For centuries, India and China had stood as two ancient giants, often divided, sometimes suspicious, yet united by a shared weight of history. Now, in the 21st century, they were meeting not as colonized subjects in Europe's imperial textbooks, but as authors of a new chapter. The red carpet was less about pomp and more about prophecy. Because beneath every flash of the camera, beneath every handshake, was a deeper story, that the world was no longer unipolar. That India's civilizational rise could no longer be contained within Western narratives. That the global South, with India as one of its strongest voices, was preparing to redefine what power looked like in the modern age. And that is why the moment mattered. It was not ceremony, it was history reclaiming itself. And for Washington and its allies, watching from afar, the panic was only beginning. The Beijing air was crisp, the streets lined with flags fluttering in synchronized precision. Modi's arrival was no ordinary diplomatic call, it was a performance, a stage crafted to send a message to the watching world. Cameras captured every frame. Chinese officials bowing in respect, red carpet unfurled like a royal welcome, dancers swirling in vibrant costumes, fireworks tracing the sky. It wasn't just hospitality. It was symbolism. Beijing was elevating Modi as not merely the leader of India, but as a peer among global titans. The imagery was striking. For years, Washington had been the arena where leaders sought validation, where alliances were sealed in staged photo ops at the White House lawn. But here, in the heart of Asia, the optics told another story. America's grip on narrative dominance was slipping. As Modi stood shoulder to shoulder with Xi, the cameras didn't capture a guest and a host, they captured two poles of power, facing the future together. Back in Washington, the unease was palpable. In think tanks from Georgetown to the Hudson Institute, analysts scrambled to dissect the meaning. Reports leaked of late-night discussions at the National Security Council. The question on every strategist's lips was blunt: if India and China were even partially aligned, what did that mean for the West's long-standing strategy of containment? The panic was not only about economics, though that alone was seismic. If Beijing and New Delhi found common ground, it meant the markets of 2.5 billion people could slowly tilt away from American leverage. It meant trade corridors across Asia would no longer be dictated by Washington's sanctions or tariffs. But the unease went deeper, into the psychological fabric of Western power. America had long expected India to play the role of junior partner, an ally that shared democratic values, yet never questioned who set the rules. Modi's reception in Beijing shattered that illusion. Commentators on CNN and the BBC tried to downplay it. "This is ceremonial, nothing more," one insisted. Yet the images betrayed them. Because what mattered wasn't the handshake or the speeches, it was the elevation. The fact that China, America's foremost rival, was giving India a spotlight equal to its own rattled the West more than any policy paper could. Meanwhile, in Washington, cracks in confidence grew sharper. European allies, already fatigued by America's erratic leadership in the Trump era, began whispering about Asia as the new stage of serious diplomacy. If Modi could walk Beijing's red carpet today, what would stop him from brokering deals tomorrow that excluded the West entirely? The fear was no longer abstract, it was visible, captured in the still frames of a global broadcast. And then came the moment that even Western journalists couldn't ignore. As Modi stood at the Great Hall of the People, Xi Jinping turned and addressed him not as a guest, but as a partner in shaping Asia's destiny. Cameras caught the words. Translations flashed across international feeds. The subtext was unmistakable. China was no longer treating India as a competitor to be contained, but as a collaborator in rewriting the balance of power. The reaction in Washington was swift. Editorials screamed warnings of an Asian century without America. Former diplomats cautioned that the US had taken India's loyalty for granted. Yet, beneath the outrage was something deeper, a recognition that the world's tectonic plates were shifting faster than expected. For decades, the West had assumed rivalry between India and China would prevent any meaningful cooperation. But as the red carpet rolled on, those assumptions began to look dangerously outdated. In living rooms across Asia and Africa, the message resonated differently. For the global South, the visuals of Modi and Xi side by side were not a threat, but a promise that tomorrow's world order would not be monopolized by the West. That the time of dictation was ending, and a new conversation, rooted in equality, was beginning. For Washington, it was humiliation disguised as anxiety. For India, it was affirmation. And for China, it was strategy. But for the watching world, the debate was no longer about if the rivalry would escalate. It was about how soon the West would have to admit it was no longer the only author of history. The evening in Beijing shimmered with a kind of choreography that felt less like diplomacy and more like destiny. The city, cloaked in neon and tradition, was alive with spectacle. Lanterns swayed across boulevards, performers rehearsed routines that blended Chinese grace with Indian rhythm, and the world's cameras hummed with anticipation. This was not just a state visit, it was theater, and the script had been written to shake the foundations of global politics. When the Chinese ambassador stepped up to the podium, the words he delivered were simple but seismic. India and China, he declared, were the twin engines of Asia. The phrase landed with the weight of a MIC drop. Commentators, translators, and social media feeds carried it across the globe in real time. It was more than a diplomatic compliment. It was a recalibration of narrative. For decades, America had enjoyed the status of sole conductor of the orchestra. Now, in one symbolic line, Beijing was announcing that the future would be composed by two hands, the dragon and the elephant. The symbolism deepened as the evening unfolded. In the Great Plaza, a cultural performance began. Dancers in red and gold silks moved in patterns that traced ancient Chinese myths, while moments later, Indian performers joined them, draped in saffron and emerald. The drums of Kathak fused with the gongs of Beijing opera, the movements of Bharatanatyam entwined with the fluid arcs of Chinese martial arts. The stage became a tapestry where two civilizations that had once clashed now moved in harmony. The dragon and the elephant danced, not as rivals circling each other, but as partners weaving a new rhythm for the 21st century. Western journalists who had dismissed the visit as mere ceremony now scrambled for words. Because this wasn't ceremony, it was story. A story designed to broadcast across Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, that the world no longer had to look westward for validation. The heart of global power was beating in Asia, and its twin pulses were China and India. For Washington, the blow was sharper than any tariff or treaty. For months, U.S. officials had sought to use trade pressure to keep New Delhi aligned. Tariffs, sanctions, subtle threats, tools America had wielded for decades, were supposed to remind India of its place in the Western-led order. But in Beijing's glittering performance, those tools looked blunt and ineffective. Because influence is not only about economics, it is about imagery, legitimacy, belonging. And on that night, India belonged to a stage larger than Washington's grasp. Inside American think tanks, the phrase twin engines of Asia became an obsession. What did it mean strategically? Would it evolve into a formal bloc, a counterweight to NATO, or something more fluid yet equally powerful? No one had answers, only alarms. The arrogance of assuming India would forever be content as Washington's junior partner now collided with the reality of a nation reclaiming civilizational pride. And pride was at the heart of it. For India, this was not about abandoning democracy or aligning blindly with Beijing. It was about recognition. Recognition that its voice mattered not as an accessory, but as a force. Modi's subtle smile during the performances reflected that shift. For centuries, India had been told it was too divided, too chaotic, too dependent to ever lead. Yet here, in Beijing, it was elevated as an equal, celebrated not just for its potential but for its presence. The spectacle carried another layer of genius, the motifs of both civilizations intertwined. Chinese dragons curled around lotus petals, while Indian elephants paraded with red silk banners bearing Mandarin characters. Fireworks lit the sky in the colors of both nations' flags, bursting into patterns that alternated between the chakra wheel and the dragon scales. Every detail reinforced the message. Together, these two civilizations could script a future where the West was no longer the center of the map. The American response was defensive, almost panicked. Editorial boards in New York warned of authoritarian bonding, though the irony wasn't lost on the global South, coming from a nation that had long partnered with monarchies and dictators when it suited its interests. European leaders, still reeling from trade disputes with Washington, hesitated to echo the alarm. Quietly, some admitted that a multipolar world might be more honest, more reflective of reality than the charade of Western monopoly. But beyond strategy, what unsettled the West most was the optics of joy. Because while America's summits had grown stale, transactional, and often tense, the India-China moment was filled with laughter, color, and cultural embrace. It wasn't paperwork, it was poetry. It wasn't coercion, it was celebration. The dragon and the elephant were not negotiating terms, they were dancing. And that dance sent a message more powerful than any communique: the future could be written without America's permission. Across Africa and Latin America, televisions lit up with images of the performance. In Nairobi tea houses, in Sao Paulo cafes, in Jakarta markets, people watched two non-Western civilizations stand tall without apology. For many, it was vindication. They too had endured lectures from the West about governance, economy, and culture, even while being treated as second class. Now, watching Modi and Xi celebrated as equal stewards of Asia, they glimpsed their own possibility, that they too could be part of a world no longer narrated exclusively by Washington or Brussels. Back in Washington, the villain faltered. The confidence that had once fueled speeches about leading the free world now seemed hollow. How could America claim undisputed leadership when two of the world's largest nations were visibly charting a different course? For the first time in decades, the monopoly of influence was not simply contested. It was mocked, bypassed, rewritten. Yet the West was not finished. Already, whispers began of counter-strategies. More defense pacts, more trade carrots, more subtle attempts to drive a wedge between Beijing and New Delhi. But even as those whispers spread, the images from Beijing lingered like a bruise on America's pride. Because while strategies could shift, the moment could not be erased. The MIC drop had already landed, echoing across continents. The world had seen it: the ambassador's declaration, the cultural fusion, the dragon and elephant moving in tandem. It was a counterattack not with missiles or sanctions, but with narrative, imagery, symbolism. And in geopolitics, those tools cut deeper than steel. For India, it was the affirmation of its civilizational rise. For China, it was proof that the West could no longer isolate it. For the global South, it was inspiration. And for America, it was humiliation cloaked in denial. The night ended with fireworks cascading over Beijing's skyline, explosions of red, gold, saffron, and green. The crowd erupted in applause, but the real audience was global. Because the message had been delivered with precision, Asia was no longer waiting for the West to approve its destiny. And as the smoke cleared, one truth stood undeniable: the monopoly of power had cracked. The dragon and the elephant had danced, and the world would never forget the rhythm they created together. The morning after the Beijing spectacle, the world woke up to headlines that no amount of Western spin could dilute. Images of Modi standing shoulder to shoulder with Xi Jinping, and in one frame, even Vladimir Putin, circulated like wildfire. The symbolism was almost unbearable for Washington and its allies. Three leaders, often portrayed in Western media as divided or adversarial, now appearing on the same stage, exchanging smiles under the glow of fireworks. CNN ran the images with a tone of restrained alarm, headlining, "Modi walks the global tightrope, but which way is he leaning?" The Guardian's coverage struck deeper, noting, "The optics from Beijing mark a seismic shift, the world's largest democracy celebrated in the capital of the world's most powerful one-party state." To Western audiences, it was disorienting, even unsettling. For decades, the narrative had been simple: democracy versus autocracy, West versus the rest. Yet here was India, the jewel of the democratic camp, being honored not in Washington, but in Beijing. On social media, the reaction was even more explosive. Hashtags surged within hours: #AsianCentury, #IndiaChina Unity, #Global South Rising. Twitter threads dissected the cultural performances, Instagram Reels replayed the ambassador's Twin Engines of Asia line, and TikTok edits dramatized the dragon and elephant dance to thundering music. For billions across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the message resonated. The future was no longer about fitting into Western frameworks, it was about reclaiming agency. For Washington, the blow was not just geopolitical but psychological. The think tanks that had, for years, published white papers predicting India's role as America's natural partner now scrambled to reassess. At the Brookings Institution, one analyst wrote an emergency brief: "Has India slipped away from America's orbit?" At the Council on Foreign Relations, discussions turned somber. If New Delhi is no longer reliably aligned, the US Indo-Pacific strategy collapses before it even begins. What rattled Washington most was that the shift wasn't merely transactional. This wasn't about one trade deal or one summit, it was about optics, pride, and identity. The Beijing visit had shown India being courted not as a subordinate, but as an equal. America, which had long expected India to remain its junior partner, suddenly looked like the one left waiting outside the banquet hall. Europe, too, felt the tremors. For Brussels, the specter of a tighter India-China understanding posed an existential dilemma. For years, European leaders had convinced themselves that even if America's influence waned, they could still act as cultural and diplomatic anchors for the global South. But the images from Beijing suggested otherwise. When India, a country with deep historic ties to Britain and Europe, chose to stand in sync with China, it signaled that Europe's relevance might be slipping faster than anticipated. European newspapers reflected the unease. Le Monde warned that a Eurasian axis is no longer theoretical, it is forming in real time. Der Spiegel observed bluntly, if New Delhi turns eastward, Europe risks being sidelined in the Asian century. Even in London, where the political class still clung to illusions of a special relationship with India, the tabloids could not ignore the optics. The Daily Mail lamented, Britain's former colony now finds its destiny in Beijing, not Whitehall. But it was the global south where the shockwaves became fuel. In Nairobi, hashtags like #AsiaLeads trended, with commentators noting that Africa, too, could reject the binary choices imposed by the West. In Sao Paulo, Brazilian pundits drew parallels between BRIC solidarity and India's new prominence, speculating whether Latin America might also carve its own path. In Jakarta, Indonesia's media asked openly, if India can balance China without Western permission, why can't we? The ripple effect wasn't just about geopolitics, it was about psychology. For decades, the West had dominated not only through power but through narrative. It had positioned itself as the center of legitimacy. Global summits meant Western capitals, partnerships required Western blessing, recognition depended on Western validation. But Beijing's red carpet embrace of Modi shattered that illusion. Recognition had been redefined. Washington's official response was carefully scripted but thin. A State Department spokesperson insisted, our partnership with India remains strong and indispensable. But the words rang hollow when juxtaposed with the images from Beijing. For many observers, it felt like denial, a refusal to acknowledge that the geopolitical tectonics had shifted. Behind closed doors, however, panic brewed. The Pentagon fretted about whether India would continue to honor defense pacts. Trade officials worried about tariffs and market access. Strategists debated whether America had overplayed its hand by pressuring New Delhi with sanctions and restrictions. The arrogance of assuming India's loyalty was permanent now looked dangerously naive. And yet, the greatest sting wasn't in policy but in perception. America, long accustomed to being the star of the show, now looked like a sidelined guest. The red carpet had been rolled out, but not in Washington. And that visual, a simple carpet, a simple smile, a simple handshake in Beijing, was enough to unsettle an empire. The shockwaves would not end there. For what happened in Beijing was not a conclusion, but a beginning. The Asian Century hashtag wasn't just a trend, it was a prophecy whispered across continents. And in Washington and Brussels, leaders were left asking a question they had never thought possible. If Asia is writing the next chapter of history, what role, if any, is left for the West? History has a way of turning quietly, then suddenly. For years, the West believed it alone set the tempo of global power, deciding who sat at the high table, who was admitted into clubs, and who was left out. But Beijing's red carpet for Narendra Modi marked more than just a ceremonial spectacle. It was a statement: Asia no longer needs Western validation. What unfolded on those marble steps in China's capital was more than diplomatic choreography. It was a moment of civilizational clarity. India, with its millennia-old culture, its democracy of 1.4 billion, and its voice of the global south, was not waiting for permission. By standing tall next to China, India declared that dignity was no longer for sale, that dependency was no longer destiny. For decades, the Western order thrived on a subtle imbalance. It offered praise with one hand and pressure with the other. Nations like India were celebrated as the world's largest democracy, yet punished with tariffs, sanctions, and the expectation of obedience. Washington praised India's freedom of choice, so long as the choice was convenient to American strategy. But the Beijing embrace revealed the flaw in this arrogance. The moment a nation chooses dignity over dependency, the illusion of Western monopoly crumbles. Civilizations rise not when they beg for recognition, but when they reclaim it. India's presence in Beijing was not about abandoning partnerships with the West. It was about rewriting the terms of engagement. No longer a junior partner, no longer an obedient ally, but a sovereign power with options. For billions watching across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the symbolism was liberating. It said, you, too, can chart your own course. This is the moral heartbeat of the story. Empires fall not because they lose armies, but because they lose credibility. The West's shock, America's panic, these are symptoms of something deeper. They reveal that the old rules no longer bind the world as they once did. When India walked that red carpet in Beijing, it wasn't just New Delhi's victory. It was a signal that the age of dictated hierarchies was ending. The imagery will linger, dancers weaving Indian motifs in the heart of China, fireworks illuminating the night sky, and two ancient civilizations, long pitted against one another, choosing instead to honor one another. For the West, these were just optics. For the global South, it was validation that history need not repeat itself in colonial colors. The lesson is simple yet profound. Civilizations rise when they choose dignity over dependency. Dignity means recognizing one's worth without needing external applause. Dependency means believing that power is granted, not inherent. India's pivot in Beijing was dignity in action, an assertion that power is not borrowed, it is owned. For the United States and its allies, this moment should be a mirror. Panic and shock are natural reactions when the ground shifts beneath one's feet. But perhaps the real moral for the West is this: respect cannot be demanded through arrogance, it must be earned through equality. If Washington continues to see India as a pawn, it will lose it. If Europe continues to cling to colonial nostalgia, it will be sidelined. The world has moved forward, whether the West accepts it or not. And so the red carpet in Beijing will be remembered not merely as protocol, but as prophecy. It signaled the dawn of a new balance, one where Asia leads not by force, but by choice, not through conquest, but through confidence. The West may be in shock, the United States may panic. But for billions watching, this was a moment of liberation. The illusion that the world required Western permission to rise had been broken. The dragon and the elephant had danced, and in their steps echoed the future. The world had just witnessed the dawn of a new balance.